My name is Faith Hillis. I'm the director, and welcome to the series director's lecture. We're very happy to have Kristen Ghodsee with us. Kristen Ghodsee is chair and professor of Russian and East European Studies and member of a graduate group in anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania. She is the author of 12 books, which have been cumulatively translated into 19 languages. Her most recent monograph is Everyday Utopia: What 2,000 Years of Bold Experiments Can Teach Us About the Good Life with Simon & Schuster. In addition to her academic work, she has written for articles and outlets such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Republic, die Tageszeitung, and Le Monde Diplomatique. Ghodsee is a provocative scholar who transcends disciplinary boundaries, exactly the kind of speaker we seek for this annual lecture. She will be speaking today on the gaslighting of Eastern Europe. Welcome to Ghodsee.
Much for that generous introduction. I'm really excited to be giving this lecture today. Gaslighting of Eastern Europe. It is really hot off the press, as in about an hour ago, I was still making changes to this presentation. So just signaling, I'm sure most people know what this means, but the term gaslighting has a very specific someone into questioning their own perception of reality in order to gain that person. And so I'm going to start with a poem. Not a good poem, but it's my outline for the talk. It won't be that bad. It's worse than we thought, but there are no alternatives. It's not as bad as you think. All the bad things are your fault. What are you talking about? Happen? It's just your imagination. So I really want to emphasize that this is a work in progress. I'm very early on. I barely had time to do the research and writing that I hoped to do. And so what you're getting is an attempt to be coherent about what I imagine will probably end up being my next book project. Time and space willing, sabbatical willing. So I'm going to start you off on a very important day, November 10th, 1989.
From 8 tonight with Peter Jennings, reporting tonight from Berlin. From the Berlin Wall specifically, take a look at them. They've been there since last night. They are here in the thousands. They are here in the tens of thousands. Occasionally they shout, "Die Mauer muss weg, the wall must go." Thousands and thousands of West Germans come to make the point that the wall has suddenly become irrelevant. Something as you can see almost a party on. How do you measure such an astonishing moment in history? The East German government said tonight they were going to make more openings in the wall, at least a dozen more. Put bulldozers right through the wall so that more people could cross to the west. The East German communist leadership tonight said there'd be a new election law guaranteeing secret elections which the rest of the world could monitor. And only 24 hours after East Germans were told they could go anywhere, anytime, the Soviet Union said that was a sensible move.
Thousands of East Germans came across the border today, perhaps more than 100,000, so many that border police lost count. And at every border crossing, thousands of West Germans there to say welcome. Some of the really good news today was for the East German government. While thousands and thousands came to look, even gape at this showcase of capitalism, the vast majority said they would be going back. The simple act of giving people the freedom to travel may have convinced these Germans they need not take flight whenever the door opens just a fraction.
Okay, so some of you may remember that moment. I certainly do. It was an incredible moment in history, rather unexpected. And it precipitated a very interesting debate about Europe after the Berlin Wall. One way, it won't be that bad. This debate incarnation was a debate between on one hand and option one, other two bill. Both the graduates understood that moving economic education, but in both cases, the belief that these would be both short. The economist, then a professor at Harvard, wrote a very influential January 1990 in Economist under the quite interesting what be done. Must reject ideas about a third way, just like chimerical market socialism based on public and goes economy. Western observers should over dramatize layoff. And like the rest of these, little unemployment. Much of the is the result of economies running at unsustainably low rates of unemployment. Employment rates, even above the 5% or so, tolerated.
So the key thing here is that Sachs, as with most people at this particular moment in time, believed that this would take a few years. Okay, I want you to remember that a few years because it comes back over and over again. The other thing that's really important about this article is that Jeffrey Sachs believed that shock therapy should be coupled with significant debt forgiveness for the countries of Eastern Europe and a massive foreign aid package akin to a second Marshall Plan. That is also in this article. Now, you have to understand that for businesses in the West, this idea of building liberal democracy became immaterial to the possibility of very quick profits in Eastern Europe. This is a December 1989 article from Forbes magazine stating that factory workers earn about $140 a month in Hungary and $40 a month in Poland. That compares with $235 a month for a Portuguese factory worker, $1,500 for a Spanish worker, and $3,000 for a West German worker. Lastly, many East European factories are selling at bargain prices, says Jeffrey Burt, a lawyer who negotiates joint ventures in the Soviet Union and Hungary. These countries are up for sale. Milton Friedman also penned a very influential article called The Road to Freedom in May 1990, which was published then in the National Review. He was very much an advocate of shock therapy and of an immediate rush to free market liberal capitalism. This is a quote: "A drastic reduction in the size of government will be attainable, I believe, only under conditions of extreme crisis and only if done rapidly. Macbeth's words about the assassination of Duncan, if it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly, are equally applicable to the assassination of a totalitarian government." Later, Naomi Klein would talk about the shock doctrine in her book of the same name. Again, back to Friedman. "Even though many required measures can and should be taken quickly, the transition to a stable and prosperous competitive capitalist society will inevitably take years, not months. It will require patience on the part of the populace and faith that matters are moving in the right direction. Inevitably, some people and groups will suffer in the process." And Friedman goes on to make a case that the West should not give a cent of foreign aid to Eastern Europe. Now, Michael Novak, in June of 1990, wrote in Forbes magazine. You may not have heard of Michael Novak, but he was quite an influential figure at that time. He's here seated with Jeane Kirkpatrick in the Reagan administration. When he died, the Washington Post called him the theologian that made a spiritual case for capitalism. He talked initially about the moral pollution of East Europeans. This is a quote. "Two generations in Eastern Europe have never experienced private property, free contracts, markets, or inventive enterprise. People were taught by communist regimes to despise those who get ahead and to pull them down. They need 1,000 Horatio Alger stories in the press. Respect for success must sweep these cultures like a hit rock tune." Also, what's going to sweep these countries is the sudden rapaciousness of Western corporations looking at a market of 64 million consumers that had previously not had access to Western goods and services. This is a quote from Forbes magazine. "Everyone understands the pull of this diverse region. It is a market of 64 million well-educated people. Labor is cheap. In Hungary, it's $2 an hour, and in Poland, 50 cents, excluding benefits." Now, for those of you who grew up in the 80s and remember the late 80s and early 90s, you will also remember that this was the moment of the ascendancy of leveraged buyouts and corporate raiders. This is Gordon Gekko, played by Michael Douglas in the famous 1987 Oliver Stone film Wall Street. And the ideal of corporate raiding is buy, strip, and flip. You buy corporations that are undervalued, you strip away their assets, and you sell them on or run them into bankruptcy. This was the heyday of corporate raiding in the United States. And there are all sorts of great stories that I could tell you about this, but I just want to plant that in your minds for those of you who don't remember Wall Street, Gordon Gekko, or the late 80s. So what does this look like in practice? What happens? This may be familiar to some of you, but I'm going to walk you through it just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So the first thing that happens is that many of these countries are in debt to the West. And other than Poland, almost none of them get significant debt forgiveness from Western commercial banks. That means that the only place that they can get credit in order to jumpstart this shock therapy process is from the International Monetary Fund. And the International Monetary Fund funds almost always come with what is called conditionality, a set of packages at that time referred to as the Washington Consensus that countries had to implement in order to access funds for their transition projects. What that usually meant was price liberalization. Previously subsidized foodstuffs, goods and services that the government had kept prices down so that they would be accessible to a wide range of people in the population. You take away those subsidies and suddenly you liberalize prices. That is combined with a slashing of government spending in order to control hyperinflation, in order to reduce deficits. These are all have to be done at the same time. You also, in the process of slashing government spending, you immediately and radically dismantle your social safety nets because, let's face it, they cost money, and you're trying to control spending, and you're liberalizing prices. You're also going to embark on what's called mass privatization, the selling off of your industrial base in a very quick and rapid way, in which is going to create lots of layoffs. And finally, and very importantly, for something that I'm going to talk about later, you liberalize capital accounts. And that means that you allow international funds, international monies, capital to flow freely in to your country, hopefully to attract foreign investment. And here's the rub, also to flow very freely out of the country, because the ability to repatriate profits is what's going to attract foreign investors. So what this means is mass privatization creates a fire sale of East German industries. This is a simple question of supply and demand. A lot of things are for sale. There are very few buyers, so the prices go down through the floor. Only foreigners have capital because obviously these were socialist societies. There wasn't a lot of savings, certainly not in hard currency. And so these are particularly sales that are targeting foreign investors. Restructuring, which I will talk about more in a moment, leads to mass unemployment, and privatization leads to, not surprisingly, asset stripping, liquidation, and monopolistic consolidation for West European firms who are interested in shutting down potential East European competition for their own goods and services. Now, Janusz Kornai, one of the most influential East European economists at the time, was very wary about the suggestions that economists like Jeffrey Sachs were making, and certainly Milton Friedman. This is a quote from his article, The Road to a Free Economy in 1990. The economic policy proposed here cautions against the offensive and irresponsible liquidation of state ownership. It warns against carrying out the reverse action as precipitously and with a similar irresponsibility as the radical elimination of private property. State wealth must not be sold to foreign countries at rock bottom prices, as if at a liquidation sale. And he goes on to say that East Europeans need time to build the institutions that are necessary in order to create capitalism. Now, that's a lot of very technical detail. I understand that not everybody here works in world international finance, so I'm going to give you a specific case study. It's a case study that is particularly relevant right now because of what just happened in September in the East German elections. This is the case study of East Germany. So in July 1990, Helmut Kohl, then the Chancellor of East Germany, as they're preparing to reunify the currencies, tells the East Germans in a televised address, no one will be worse off than before, but it will be much better for many. And I have to tell you, as somebody who was actually on Alexanderplatz in the summer of 1990, drinking copious amounts of beer with East Germans because I had Ostmarks that needed to be spent, that people believed him. Ordinary people believed that what was coming for them was prosperity and democracy and freedom. This, in October 1990, is another clip from a televised address that Helmut Kohl gave on the eve of German reunification on October 3rd. I'm just going to play you the audio. The German is on the left, the English on the right.
Hinzu komme Fleiß und Leistungsbereitschaft bei den Menschen der bisherigen DDR. Durch unsere gemeinsamen Anstrengungen, durch die Politik der sozialen Marktwirtschaft, werden schon in wenigen Jahren aus Brandenburg, aus Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, aus Sachsen-Anhalt und aus Thüringen blühende Landschaften geworden sein.
This has become a now infamous speech. Kohl again repeats, in a few years, the states of the former East will become flourishing landscapes, blooming landscapes of prosperity. So what actually happens? East German enterprises, assets, real estate, and agricultural cooperatives are transferred to a federal trust agency. Created on 17th June 1990, the Treuhand oversaw the restructuring and sale of about 8,500 state-owned companies with over 4 million employees. In 1989, East Germany had a population of about 16 million, which means that the Treuhand had control of 1 out of every 4 employees in Eastern Europe. What they did was very interesting, and I can go into greater detail if anyone is interested. One of the sources that I'm using are these transition newsletters. These were internal documents in the World Bank discussing various transition policies. All of the enterprises were automatically converted into companies on July 1st. They are to be fully restructured according to the West German joint stock or limited liability company laws by October. The Treuhand would reorganize companies before their sale, which usually meant laying off most of the workers. Sorry. you can see here that even in the World Bank's own prediction, the Trojhand will reorganize or close non-viable enterprises. The Minister of Economics recently guessed that 30% of state enterprises would be competitive. Another 40% could be restructured, and 30% would have to be reorganized or closed. By the fall of 1991, after, and I should mention this in case you don't remember, the assassination of the head of the Trojhand, Detlev Rohwedder. There's a great Netflix documentary, if anybody's interested. Still unsolved assassination of this guy. Manfred Bock, the former director for privatization of the Trojhand, explained, the present privatization process is also characterized by grave labor difficulties. Although the enterprises of the Trojhand presently employ 2.1 million people, after 4 million 1 year before, some 400,000 will have to be dismissed by the end of 1991. Their official dismissal will mean that the unemployment rate in East Germany could go up to 40% by the end of the year. He also admitted that West German industry has mainly used privatization to broaden its production base and gain access to a new market of 16 million consumers. Now, from very early on in this process, there were Western journalists that were paying attention to the fraud and corruption and underhanded practices that were going on under the guise of this Trojhand privatization. This is a quote from a Christian Science Monitor article in 1991. The Trojhand has also come under heavy criticism for selling companies at far below market prices, market value. The Berlin prosecutor, for instance, is investigating a Trojhand department head for allegedly selling an electronics company to a group of investors for 1 Deutschmark. The Trojhand's resident state prosecutor is investigating about 300 cases involving various improprieties. Another more recent report in 2020, retrospectively looking back at this process of Trojhand privatization, mass privatization, found that by 1995, when the Trojhand had concluded its main activities, 51% of the firms, 64% of the turnover, and 68% of the jobs analyzed in the sample had fallen into the hands of West German investors. The sample further shows that the more productive the companies were, the higher was the ownership share of West German buyers. And so basically what West Germans did was they used federal funds to do leveraged buyouts on East German companies, which they stripped and flipped or ran into bankruptcy. All the meanwhile, we know from a 1998 study that there was a massive spike in mortality rates for East Germans between 1989 and 1991. This report found that the excess deaths were attributed to the, quote, drastic social, political, and economic changes that took place during the transition to from socialism to the market economy. Thousands lost their lives prematurely from the psychosocial stress associated with the transition. The other thing that's really interesting is that within the World Bank itself and the IMF and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which was created to deal with these countries in Eastern Europe, there was an understanding that unemployment would disproportionately hurt some groups more than others. Quote, some groups of workers, the older and the less skilled, might experience special reemployment difficulties, while others, women, minorities, might be particularly vulnerable to job loss over and over. I found this very interesting quote from Ivan Kostov, who was then the Bulgarian Minister of Finance. He later became the Prime Minister. In October 1991, in a meeting of foreign ministers, of finance ministers with World Bank officials, he explained, unemployment is a burning issue, reaching 10% this year. One solution could be to encourage women, 93% of whom are employed, to leave the workforce and return to their families, even if it means a temporary loss of purchasing power for their families. Now, I want you to just pause for a second and see what he's doing. He is fudging the unemployment numbers by making women housewives. If you close the daycare centers and women don't have anybody to look after their kids, they have no choice but to go home, and they're not going to be seeking work, so they won't be officially unemployed. And the reason that Kostov says this in 1991 is because that is exactly what they did in East Germany. These are quotes from Daphne Berdahl's brilliant ethnography, Where the World Ended. Because when these East German women lost their jobs en masse, they suffered greatly. Quote, feelings of superfluousness and financial insecurity, as well as the loss of a worker identity inculcated through 40 years of state ideology and physical labor, contributed to many women's confusion and depression. My friend Sylvia, one woman told me, she just sits at home and cries. Another woman in her mid-40s, who often shared with me her feelings of depression and isolation, explained sadly, this idea that a woman should stay at home and only do her housework came all at once. It happened overnight, too quickly. In an article reflecting on German reunification 1 year on, this is published in 1992, a journalist looks at the wreckage of this Troy hand process and writes, initially, East Germans satisfied some of their needs with the rich array of West German consumer goods. But soon a sense of general deprivation deepened into a feeling of a loss of individual and group economic security, of growing personal risk, and the withdrawal of their much of their guaranteed social safety net. The obvious losses were daycare centers, work-related recreational opportunities, and housing guarantees. More telling were the changes in personal relations, the competition with fellow workers for the remaining jobs, the new commuting marriages, the tensions from layoffs in two-worker families, the search for affordable arrangements for aging relatives or single-parent families. So what in the end happens is that West German corporations bought the crown jewels of East German enterprises, they asset stripped others for a quick profit, and liquidated the rest to destroy potential competition, leaving hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people unemployed. And utterly devastating the industrial base of East Germany. Now, in recent years, the rise of the Alternative for Deutschland Party and their growing support in the eastern part of the country has been noted as its relationship to the fall of the Berlin Wall. But in a classic case of blame the victim, it's always the fault of the East Germans and never the fault of the way the West Germans carried out the transition period. A viral article that was published in a newspaper eventually became a viral best-selling 2022 book. This is Dirk Oschmann explaining, in the discourse that has prevailed since 1989, East means above all ugliness, stupidity, laziness. It means racism, chauvinism, right-wing extremism, and poverty. It means failure across the board. It's worse than we thought, but there are no alternatives. So as I'm sure you by now understand, and I will provide data to support this, the transition recessions were not short, nor were they shallow, and they quickly became depressions. And at that point, there was a discussion, was there an alternative? And there was an alternative from the very get-go, the gradualist alternative. Quite simply, if you had sold East German enterprises off at a slower pace, their prices would have been higher because the supply would have been lower. You could have also spent time creating demand among foreign investors or creating a domestic class of people who could afford to buy them. The state could maintain ownership through power sharing with workers. This was one of the promises of solidarity in Poland, which was completely abandoned in the 90s. Less unemployment would have been a result, as new firms had time to arise in order to absorb displaced workers. One of my favorite examples of this was from a taxi driver in Bulgaria in the 1990s who told me, when you build a new house, you don't tear down the old one and use it for parts to build the new one. You build the new house while you're still living in the old one, right? You don't sit out camping in front of the house that hasn't been built yet, right? Social safety nets would have been maintained to a certain extent, perhaps not as robustly, but some form of social safety net could have prevented the mortality crisis, and there would have been lower human costs. And very importantly, there would have been time to build the necessary institutions for capitalism, which is what Kornai had been talking about in 1990. So let's go back to October 1990. It's not as if these voices did not exist in the West. John Kenneth Galbraith was one of the most celebrated economists of the 20th century. And he wrote in the New York Review of Books in October 1990 that one issue with the flow of advice currently reaching the countries that are now in transition is its casual acceptance of, even commitment to, human deprivation, to unemployment, inflation, and disastrously reduced living standards. This is even seen as essential therapy. Out of the experience of unemployment and hunger will come a new and revitalized work ethic, a working force eager for the discipline of free enterprise, to each according to his ability, from each according to his need. Only a few years, there's the few years again, of suffering, and all will be well. This, I choose my words carefully, is insanity. Nothing over the centuries has more often been urged than the social reward of hardship by those who will not have to suffer it. The return to normal productive activity in Western Europe after World War II, a task less complex than that faced by East Europe and the USSR, took the better part of a decade. In Britain, it took some 7 years before sterling was fully convertible, the liberalization of capital accounts. And food rationing and associated price controls were similarly continued. So even in Western Europe, they did the gradualist approach. They did not recommend shock therapy. It should not be a criticism of this transition that it is done gradually and with thought. And at the very end of this article, Galbraith, like Sachs before him, pleads for a second Marshall Plan, a massive infusion of aid to the countries of former Eastern Europe that would take the form of direct grants as well as debt forgiveness. Janusz Kornai, also in 1992, looking at the wreckage of the Hungarian economy, started to worry about what he called Weimarization. And I quote, "The reduction in the real income of a sizable portion of the population and the previously unknown phenomenon of mass unemployment have produced broad economic discontent. If the strength and extent of this discontent reaches a critical threshold, it will pose serious dangers." Recalling the conditions in early 1930s Germany, Kornai warned that economically induced disillusionment provides a fertile breeding ground for demagogy, cheap promises, and desires for iron-handed leadership. Kornai in 1992 essentially predicts Viktor Orban, not surprisingly. But the problem in 1992, this is again that conference of finance ministers with the World Bank in October 1991, is that, remember, the goal in Eastern Europe was to build both free market capitalism and liberal democracy. After years of communism, people finally had the ability to vote in free and fair elections. And it turns out, as I will show, and I have a lot more evidence to prove, that people in the West very quickly jettisoned the idea of supporting liberal democracy in favor of free market capitalism. This is Václav Klaus. The reform is a continuous process and must go on without hesitation or interruption. Otherwise, opponents have time to prepare a defense against change. Anders Åslund, one of the most influential Western economists in this process, he's from Sweden. He also wrote that the abolition of subsidies and the balancing of the state budget imply that the population inevitably will suffer substantially. It is much easier to get all of the harsh measures adopted in the political process as one big package of legal acts by the parliament. Otherwise, the legislative process will become long and arbitrary, and key acts will be rejected. Moreover, experience shows that people, if they have been properly informed, will accept a democratically adopted harsh stabilization with surprising ease. People can take a lot of suffering if they are convinced of the depth of the crisis and believe that severe measures will bring the upturn closer. So Åslund again is saying we must do this quickly because otherwise people will vote against reform. And he's really disingenuous in saying that if people are properly informed, and of course they've been told a few years, it's not going to be a few years, they will vote and accept this incredible suffering that they're about to feel. Tadeusz Kowalik, who was a member of Solidarity, also took to the pages of Dissent in the fall of 1991, and he wrote, "Listening to Sachs address the Solidarity members of parliament in 1989, I was reminded of the Soviet emissaries of the 1940s, advising the most radical and rapid revolution. In the same spirit, although in the opposite direction, Sachs called on us to implement shock therapy, which, by reducing inflation, would stabilize the economy and simultaneously create a market system. As a procedure intended to change the economic system, shock therapy has proved a disaster. Whatever its achievements, they are dwarfed by the enormous social costs." Now, I'm just going to pause for a second because some of you may not know this data, and I'm going to pass this around. This comes from my 2021 book, co-authored with my colleague, Mitchell Orenstein. I just want to show you what we're actually talking about here so you have an understanding of the depth of the crisis. So in our book, we used a variety of different data from 29 countries from 1989 or 91, depending on where we were in the region, up until 2018. The book came out in 2021. The blue line represents the Great Depression of the United States, with the starting year being 1929. And what you can see, depression is a technical term. It means 3 years of negative economic growth. You can see there's a plummet and then slowly a return to baseline at about year 8, thanks to World War II, right? And then great growth for the United States. What you can see is for the top 10 transition countries, and this would include Poland, you have an initial decline in productivity by about 20%, and you return to baseline again at about year 8. So it's not a few years, it's year 8. And then you have a sort of slow, steady increase. This is the J-curve transition. This is the transition that we're consistently told about when we talk about transition economics in Eastern Europe. The median 10 countries, which is the yellow line, you can see that they have an output decline of 40% of GDP, and that they do not return to baseline for 17 years before they start to experience growth again. And if you look at this red line, which is the bottom 10 countries, which I think is interesting to note, includes Ukraine, by 2018, they still had standards of living worse as measured by GDP per capita than they had under communism. Exactly. Yes. Poland is an interesting exception, partially because Jeffrey Sachs was personally able to negotiate debt forgiveness for the Poles. And there was a lot more aid and foreign investment in Poland than there were in other Central European countries. There's a lot going on, yes, but there was a lot of aid as well. If you don't want to look at GDP per capita, fine. GDP per capita has its own problems. Let's just look at poverty. We use the World Bank poverty rate for Eastern Europe, which is $5.50 a day. It is higher than the global poverty rate because of winter. In these countries, if you don't have heat, you die in the winter. And so it costs more to live in Eastern Europe than it does in a lot of global South countries where winter doesn't mean death. So when we looked at peak poverty rates, which was about 1999, about 191 million people in the region were living below the World Bank's poverty rate for the region. And this was known. So one of the things that I'm looking at are lots of UN documents, especially from UNICEF and UNDP. This is a report that came out of the Innocenti project in Florence that was socially monitoring the human impacts of transition in Eastern Europe. From January of 1992 to the first half of 1994, the death rate in Russia rose by over 30%, a rise of a magnitude never before seen in an industrialized country without a war or a famine. Despite a large presence in Moscow, the international community continues to turn out reports in 1994 that use no data later than 1992, when the explosive rise in the death rate began. More recent data are available, and we feel it is a matter of urgency that they be publicized. So this is a case where UNICEF is saying the international community is really falling down on the job because they are not publicizing what is turning out to be a massive human catastrophe. They're actually obscuring it. And we know later that there was a lot of scholarship, again, quite contested, that mass privatization linked to higher death rates in transition economies. This initial report, which was published in The Lancet, was challenged. The researchers then went back to the region with a big EU grant, and they were able to really hone in on Soviet monocities, and they found really convincing evidence that non-mass privatizers had higher life expectancy and lower mortality rates than mass privatizers. Even the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which was one of the institutions responsible for implementing the shock therapy programs in Eastern Europe, in its 2016-17 transition report, explained that those born at the start of transition are 1 centimeter shorter than those born before or after, reflecting factors like stress and malnourishment. That's comparable to growing up in a war zone. These are their slides, not mine. It doesn't matter. They're talking about psychosocial stress. The fact is that there was a height differential that had micronutrient deficiencies as a result. This was confirmed for Poland in 2023 in a recent study. And it's very clear that they had a very robust data set, and they found that height differentials are correlated and caused by economic transition. Although the transition to a market economy led to an impressive increase in GDP, income gains were mostly captured by the top income groups, and mass unemployment was an important problem of the 1990s and early 2000s, which led in 2015, not led, but this was reflected in this understanding. One of the members of Solidarity, in a very controversial interview, which later became the book that you see here, explained, we were stupid. In the 1980s, we fell under the influence of neoliberal ideology. I bear a lot of responsibility here. Now, Russia is a really interesting case. I can talk more about this, but I just want to read you these series of quotes from Thomas Graham, who was the senior political analyst at the US Embassy in Moscow from 1994 to 1997. You may remember that in 1993, Eltsin dissolved the Congress of People's Deputies after they were trying to vote against economic reform. Strobe Talbot, that is the Clinton senior advisor for Russia, who later became Deputy Secretary of State, got off a plane in Moscow and said something to the effect that Russia needed more therapy and less shock. That was at least a suggestion that perhaps the economic programs that Russian reformers had been pursuing with our backing and at our urging had not done what they were supposed to do in Russia. That more attention should be given to the quality of life of average Russian citizens. That was a short-lasting view. Those people who were running US policy missed an opportunity, in part because they didn't realize that the Duma election indicated great doubts within the public about the value of both democratic and economic reform. There never really was any doubt about the direction in which we were urging Russia to go. The view, one of intellectual arrogance both here and in Russia, was that if people didn't understand this, it was because of a certain amount of ignorance, not because they had legitimate concerns. Democratic reform can lead in different directions from economic reform. The classic case was of a democratically elected state Duma being composed of people who were opposed to the type of economic reform we in the US Embassy wanted to see. Now, as all this is going on, Joseph Stiglitz, now Nobel Prize-winning economist, was chief advisor in the World Bank, and he gave a scathing speech in 1999 called Wither Reform. And he goes back to this idea that these changes are being implemented in the most undemocratic way and with high human costs. And I quote, "The irony of it all is that the modern critique of utopian social engineering was based particularly on the Bolshevik approach to the transition from capitalism to communism. The shock therapy approach tried to use many of the same principles for the reverse transition. It is almost as if many of the Western advisors just thought the Bolsheviks had the wrong textbooks instead of the whole wrong approach. With the right textbooks in their briefcases, the market Bolsheviks would be able to fly into the post-socialist countries and use a peaceful version of Lenin's methods to make the opposite transition. One deeper origin for what became known as the shock therapy approach to the transition was a moral fervor and triumphalism left over from the Cold War. Some economic Cold Warriors seem to have seen themselves on a mission to level the evil institutions of communism and to socially engineer in their place, using the right textbooks this time, the new, clean, and pure textbook institutions of a private property market economy. Only a blitzkrieg approach during the window of opportunity provided by the fog of transition would get the changes made before the population had a chance to organize to protect its previous vested interests. This mentality is a reincarnation of the spirit and mindset of Bolshevism and Jacobinism. It's not as bad as you think. After Stiglitz, the gaslighting begins. In this report, you can play with the numbers so that the bad news goes away. And very specifically in 2001, what Anders does is to go in and start to rejigger the baseline GDP figures to argue that there was only a myth of output collapse after the initial period of transition. There's also a renewed insistence on explaining to the world that gradualism would not work.
Can governments in the countries of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union try to promote growth by encouraging new firms while postponing the pain of liquidating the old sectors to a time when a cushion has been put in place? The answer is no.
Answer is no.
Can
Pretty clear. So in 2014, for the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, Branko Milanovic, a Serb economist who had been in the World Bank in the 1990s, published a very kind of incendiary blog post, which got reproduced in The Globalist, where he basically argued that only about 30% of the countries actually had achieved a success in the transition process. He wrote, there are countries with at least 3 to 4 wasted generations. At current rates of growth, it might take them 50 or 60 years, longer than they were under communism, to get back to the income levels they had at the fall of communism. All the bad things are your fault. So David Brooks in the New York Times reads Milanovic's blog post and decides to write a column about it. This column is so interesting on so many levels, but one of the levels that I think is really interesting is that Brooks admits that the news from Eastern Europe is bad. 25 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the biggest surprise is how badly most of the post-communist nations have done since. But rather than blame the way that the transition was implemented or talk about the sort of geopolitical circumstances of the late 1980s and early 1990s, David Brooks says that East Europeans have failed at the level of values. He argued that economic performance is tied to history, culture, and psychology. Firstly, they didn't reform fast enough, not as fast as we wanted them to. They didn't have the right kinds of institutions. Does that sound familiar? And most important, they lacked the correct moral ecology to support a proper market economy. So we can go back to Novak talking about the moral pollution of East Europeans. This is a report from USAID. The most profound challenge to effective economic transformation was the extent to which people had become dependent on the state, rather than taking personal responsibility for actions. In a system used to propaganda, there was a high level of skepticism as new public education campaigns were launched with pro-market messages. Basically, nobody believed the pro-market messages. I'm going to quickly try to wrap up here. Reformers, this is again from Stiglitz's 1999 speech with a reform, tried to blame the victims for not correctly implementing their ill-considered designs. One variation on this theme is to blame the failure of the shock therapy reforms on corruption and rent-seeking at every turn. But while rent-seeking and corruption were important, there was more to the failure than that. Corruption and rent-seeking may itself have been increased by the manner in which the reforms were conducted, which both destroyed the already weak social capital and which enhanced opportunities and incentives for such activities. The rapid liberalization of capital accounts allowed the aforementioned banking sector to spirit tens of billions of dollars of loot out of Russia each year, while the architects of capital account liberalization negotiated billions of international debt. This is not just some radical economist. This is the chief, at the time, the chief economist of the World Bank, admitting that what happened was a heist. Again, from USAID, before 1990, these countries were essentially closed to US businesses. In 2012, Russia alone represented a $10 billion export market for US products. In other words, US exports to Russia alone each year generate 120% of the amount spent by the US over the entire 22-year transition period in all 29 countries. That is USAID's report to Congress. And finally, what are you talking about? Nothing bad happened. It's just your imagination. On the social costs of shock therapy, although their extent has been documented by many researchers, both foreign and Polish, in the official propaganda, and especially in its exported part, they have been played down or even ignored. This is a wonderful report out of the IMF that basically claims that in most cases, there have been major improvements in living standards. And they're able to do this by using the global poverty line of $2 a day rather than the special poverty line of $5.50. So again, you can change the baseline numbers and poverty and suffering just disappear. But my favorite example of gaslighting were the news reports that covered that 2016-17 EBRD Life in Transition report. You can see here on the Financial Times, Eastern Europe's post-Soviet happiness gap with the West closes. It was only Reuters that says in their title, but inequalities remain. And if you read down into the article, you will find that a so-called happiness gap has finally closed with Western European citizens in the EBRD's latest survey, although this convergence partly reflected a decline in happiness in the advanced economies. So what is the other part? The other part is that in the initial survey, the EBRD had used 5 Western comparator countries: Germany, Italy, France, the UK, and Sweden. And when they reran the survey, they only used Germany and Italy and got rid of France and Sweden. And so because the Germans and Italians were miserable and you excluded the happier countries, the happiness gap between East Europeans and West Europeans miraculously closed. You can also see here that this Reuters article explains in 2016, only those in the top 27% of the income distribution experienced average or above average income growth. Some 23% were actually worse off now, 2016, than in 1989, while 33% experienced income growth below the G7 average. The Wall Street Journal covered this much more honestly and talked about the massive divergence in living standards between Eastern and Western European countries. And that has led to Eastern Europe being home to the fastest shrinking countries on Earth, as outmigration to the West is fueled by this massive and continuing gap in living standards within the EU. So to conclude, there's only one way. It won't be that bad. It's worse than we thought, but there are no alternatives. It's not as bad as you think. All the bad things are your fault. What are you talking about? Nothing bad happened. It's just your imagination. So this is a work in progress. I'm very happy for your questions, comments, and suggestions. And here is a partial list of my sources. Thank you for your attention. Sorry for going over.
Yeah, I've got another one.
So we're going to do hybrid questions. I'm going to take some from the room and, or should we move over?
Yeah, when you guys have a seat, and I'll get the other, you guys can share that one and I'll have the other one for the audience.
Okay. All right. No, it won't.
Why don't you sit here and have her sit there? Yeah,
Me sit there? Okay.
you sit up.
Okay. 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 I got it.
So we don't have any questions and, oh, sorry, I'm going to need the mic and we're going to need to pass it around
Okay.
in a communal way.
All right.
Your mic isn't working. Okay. So questions from the room. Yeah, yes, sir. Let me give you the mic.
Because of the Zoom.
Yeah, yeah.
Sure. So one note and then one question. So Jeffrey Sachs and his wife organized stock market in Russia, and they were expelled for insiding trading. So after this, his advice, do more democratic or less, became not so important. Second point is that you point out that in Germany, West Germany sort of use East Germany and privatize very good things. So in Russia, nobody privatized, only Russian privatized Russian. And so there is no such a thing. So what Jeffrey Sachs' point tell us that human nature is very, you cannot change. And what happened during privatization, and not because of shock therapy or something, what are these billionaires in Russia? It's the people who just use the moment. And I was in end of 80s in Russia. It was Gorbachev. Everybody was very excited, but nothing going on. Then Yeltsin came, nothing going on. And then Igor Gaidar decided to do the shock privatization, but it's something happened at least before. So it looks like there is no other way. This is what my point.
I absolutely agree with you. I mean, the idea was that there was no other way, right? And we have now, I mean, the wonderful thing is that 30 years have gone and we now have declassified memos between Eltsin and Clinton. We have documents from the CIA, from the State Department. We have memoirs of people who were there. And it's very clear that the United States understood that Russia was, I mean, you could see from USAID how much money the Americans were making by opening the Russian market. So it's not at all surprising to me. This is why I find it very interesting that Osland talks about how Democratic voters have to be properly informed. Nobody in Russia was properly informed about what was about to happen, just like people in Eastern Germany were not properly informed. You have the televised address of Kohl telling them in a few years you will be living in blooming landscapes. And in immediately after, not even a month goes by before the Troy Hand starts its decimation of the East. So I think the thing is that it's very easy to see this process with hindsight, what was going on. And it helps to understand the zeitgeist of the late 1980s in the United States, which is the rise of this corporate raider, the rise of the leveraged buyout, the rise of being able to take otherwise functioning companies and destroy them for quick profits. And I think part of the story, some people have told part of this story, but one of the parts of the story that I would really like to tell, using the words of the people who were actually debating these policies, is that I think people in the American government knew exactly what was going on, and they let it happen. Absolutely.
We actually have a mic in the back now, so that's helpful. So I see Elena.
Thank you so much for this great presentation, and I'm looking forward to the book that eventually comes out. I would be remiss if I didn't ask about this, given that we're at the University of Chicago. What about the Latin American debt crisis of the previous decade is part of the sort of boldness with which American academics, political figures, journalists, the boldness with which they're acting in Eastern Europe is kind of confirmed by what they were able to do in Latin America. And so I guess two questions, like what did people living in Eastern Europe know about what was happening in Latin America the decade before? And is there any awareness, any connection of what happened there and what was happening in a decade later in the 1980s and 1990s? And it's really, really striking how many of the same figures recur. So I'm curious if in the sources that you're reading from this later period, if you find references back to that earlier period.
Yeah, so it's very clear that the Washington consensus policies were like sort of trial run in Latin America, and that when you have this democratic transition beginning in Eastern Europe, they have the kind of moral high ground of what they did in Latin America. And so they knew it is the same people. They were empowered, right, to do what they were doing. Did East Europeans understand anything about what was about to happen? No. I mean, and this is really, really striking within Solidarity. That book, We Were Stupid, and certain members of Solidarity who have subsequently come out and just talked about how they I mean, David Ost's work on the defeat of Solidarity. There's a lot of scholarship out there, right? Naomi Klein in the shock doctrine really talks about the connections between Latin America and Eastern Europe. But I really honestly think, and I didn't have time. Jeffrey Sachs was a keynote speaker at a conference that I ran with Mitchell, and I have an incredible audio clip, which is about 5 minutes long, where I sent you the handout, but I guess we didn't get it printed. So where Jeffrey Sachs explains very clearly that this was all foreign policy. It was geopolitics. He believes that the United States, and these are his actual words, I can play you the clip if you're interested, we treated Gorbachev like shit. We treated Russia like shit, right? Because all we cared about, these are his words, was expanding NATO eastward and getting rid of communism. And whatever collateral damage was going to occur was just not our problem, which is why he, I think he's had a major kind of, reversal after he leaves Russia. And he's, I think he's now one of those people who will talk a lot about, he's willing to talk a lot about the geopolitics of that particular moment, right? And what was happening as British, American, French, and West German investors and corporations looked at Eastern Europe and said, who gets what? That's what happened. And that's a story that I think that has not been fully told, and partially because the documents haven't been available yet.
I see a hand at the back of the room and then one up here.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. I had two questions. One of them is about the gradualist approach that never was, which, you know, the slide looked really interesting. And I'm wondering, is the gradualist approach in your book going to be presented as a counterfactual, or are there any like examples from from world history that, like, you know, of a sort of more gradual transition, you know, in this kind of context that serve as models? And I was just thinking, I mean, this isn't an answer to the question, but like, you know, interestingly, neoliberalism came a lot later to parts of the Balkans where there was war, and also like development aid has a kind of weird effect of kind of staunching some of the kind of like human you know, poverty, I guess, and catastrophe that was an effect not of war, but of like, you know, post-socialism. So that was sort of an example that was like popping up into my head as like, you know, not a gradualist transition because obviously there was a war, but like something like privatization that happened somewhat differently. And then the second question is about mass migration that sort of pops up at the end of your talk. I was thinking, as you were citing the quote by Helmut Kohl about, you know, blooming landscapes, that there's a kind of way in which some people did experience blooming landscapes by moving, you know,
Yep.
some like mass amount, you know, mass kind of portion of the population just picked up and moved. And so that made me think about, like, is this a story of places or of people? Anyway, yeah.
Yeah. So on your second point, Ivan Krastev and Stephen Holmes have a lovely book called The Light That Failed. And they talk a lot about the demographic crisis and the moving of young people from East to West Europe, particularly youth. And I think, you know, there's another story to be told that is a demographic story, which is you shut down the companies. You've taken away all the wealth, like the actual industrial base there, right? What else do these countries have that we don't have that we need? Well, young people. And so there is this massive draw, as I showed you that chart from the Wall Street Journal, where because of the disparity of living standards in East and West, there is this perpetual draw of young people from the East into the West. And that's true even within Germany, right? Where Eastern Germany is still much more economically depressed, much older. There's a graying population in East Germany. There are some real significant problems that are a result of this transition that are not just about the deindustrialization. So yes, if you were one of those people who moved to West Germany or Western Europe in the 90s, life is much better for you. That is absolutely true. And I think we saw this especially around the Brexit debates, when you had all of these Polish communities in England, in the United Kingdom, who, you know, they had been there for a really long time and they were middle class. Their kids had been born there. Their kids spoke English. And then suddenly Brexit happens as they weren't prepared for that, right? They had really good lives in the UK. So your first question, I think it has to be a counterfactual. But one thing that I will talk about is China and Vietnam. I have to talk about China because China is a gradualist approach. And rather than having its economy decimated, China has done nothing but grow for the last 35 years. And they did this precisely by doing, in some ways, what Kornai was advocating for in the early 1990s. And so the problem, I mean, obviously they're not comparable, but what's interesting to me is that in those internal World Bank transition newsletters, there is a debate about whether China is a model for Eastern Europe rather than Latin America, because some economists are saying, well, Eastern Europe looks more like China than it looks like Latin America. So to come back to your question, we should think about a more gradual reform rather than a kind of shock therapy reform, because they don't have the institutions, all the things that Kornai is talking about. But of course, China is tricky because China does sort of exactly what the US decides to do, which is to not build democracy, but build free markets, right?
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I had kind of a question maybe about like sort of I know you said you're at the beginning of writing this, but about maybe the telos of this research, because I think as someone who grew up in Eastern Europe and sort of lived through some of these changes, I would say like, yeah, like this is sort of not news to, I think, people from Eastern Europe.
So what's the sort of what's the idea, I guess, behind maybe like retelling this story? Is it about like the audience, or is it about, changing minds, or is it actually about sort of is the telos more to do with like economic policy and how we think about that? Yeah, just wanted to.
So there are a couple of answers to that question. The first is that in Taking Stock of Shock, that book that's going around, that we did a conference with the World Bank in 2019, November 2019, and which the World Bank helped fund for us at the University of Pennsylvania. And we went to the World Bank to meet with the new chief economist for Europe and Central Asia. She was a Turkish woman, very friendly. And we were laying out our data. We were explaining what the conference was about. And in the middle of our kind of spiel of why they should give us, some $30,000, I don't remember what it was, she looked to her assistant and said, "Is this true?" This is 2019, the chief economist for Europe and Central and Asia at the World Bank. "Is this true? Did people suffer that much?" And thank goodness, the economist in charge of this region was like, yeah, that's pretty well known, right? Go read Stiglitz, basically, like you haven't done your homework. But then the other thing that happened is during the pandemic, Mitchell and I did Zoom book launches in Czechia, in Poland, twice in Germany. And there was a lot of incredulity among people who were shocked when they saw the data that we had presented. And in fact, in 2 cases, somebody started crying in the audience because in one case, she was like, "I knew this, but they told me I was wrong. I didn't believe myself." And in a second case, it was a young woman who said, "My mom has been complaining about this for 20 years and I never believed her." So that really got under my skin. So there's a part of this that is about a kind of like, maybe for people in Eastern Europe of a certain generation, they know, but I think a lot of young people don't know. Secondly, the deliberateness of it. I think it has always been presented as, "Oh, well, it just happened," right? What were we going to do? There were no other alternatives. Like there was this, it was a chaotic moment. Nobody expected it. We weren't prepared. Clinton wasn't the right president. A lot of people blame Clinton. Clinton being like a domestic president from governor of Arkansas. What did he know about foreign policy, right? And yet, if you go back into the documents, you can see that they were having discussions. They were debating what is how many Russian lives are we willing to sacrifice for this policy to work the way we want it to go? And then third of all, I think it is about contemporary economic policy. I don't think it's a secret for those of you who know me that I tend to be fairly political. And I believe that a lot of things in the world are the way they are today because of what happened in 1989 and the story that we tell ourselves in the West about 1989. And if we want to change our current political moment, we have to go back and reassess what happened in the 90s. And that's not just for people in Eastern Europe. That's also for people in the West. That's also for people in China. That's people all over the globe. There was a particular set of choices that was made in the 80s and 90s that I think we are still feeling the reverberations of today.
Yes.
Okay, first question concerning the chart with the GDP per capita. Is it
Yes.
adjusted for inflation or no?
I believe so, yes. Yeah.
Okay. And
Yeah.
another question is, can you expand on the factors that you think played the role why there was this variation in the country, like why some countries recovered so like relatively fast with respect to the others? You mentioned about the involvement of Jeffrey Sachs in Poland, but in general.
Yeah. So if I, had that audio clip or the handout, what Jeffrey Sachs talks a lot about is geography. The East European countries that were not part of the Soviet Union were seen as countries that should rejoin Europe, right? So there was a real sense of a desire among Western investors and Western elites to reincorporate Poland, Czechia, Slovakia, Hungary, to a lesser extent, Romania and Bulgaria, into the West. The former Soviet Union, not interested. And so when you start to break down, and like we took Slovenia, you know, and Croatia, good Catholic countries, leave the Orthodox out, right? There's a little bit of this Cold Warrior thing going on at the time, which is which countries, you know, sort of fell behind the Iron Curtain through no fault of their own, and which countries, you know, are just like kind of hopeless. So geography plays a really big role. I think the other thing, I want to speak to something that the gentleman over here mentioned, which is there was also kind of an understanding that there was going to be a looting. Anybody who saw what happened in Eastern Germany understood that there was going to be looting. And so, and if you didn't do it, somebody else would. So there was a kind of scramble to get the best things quickly. And in some countries, notably Russia, but also some of the Central Asian countries, there was a sense among some of the former communist elites that they could loot too, right? If somebody was going to loot, why don't we loot too? And particularly because of the forceful nature of capital account liberalization, the ability to move massive amounts of money out of the country overnight, that meant that looting was not only easy, but really easy to get away with. And so some countries, you have just a lot more domestic looting than foreign looting. And that's also very interesting. But one of the biggest things that Mitchell and I found when we were doing the research for this book is that using the unit of the nation state hides all sorts of inequalities within the nation state. And that is really clear for a place like Poland, which is always billed as a success story. But when you dig in, there's a reason that the Law and Justice Party were able to take power by sort of fanning the flames of this sense of grievance. So I think there are multiple factors. Part of it has to do with Western policies, levels of foreign investment. Part of it has to do with natural resources. Some countries had oil, other countries did not have oil. So it's not easy to tell a simple story. It's complicated, but you can definitely make the generalization that generally speaking, the closer you were to Western Europe, the better you did. The further away from Western Europe, the worse you did. If you happen to be a man and you were educated and relatively young, living in an urban center, life is pretty good. If you were a woman or you were on the older side or you're living in a rural area and you have less than a college education and you don't speak any foreign languages, things for you are probably not better today than they were 35 years ago.
And then
Hi, thanks very much. That was really interesting. I feel empowered to mention Hungary because you had Kornai as one of your heroes. And I want to speak to what you just said. I didn't want to charge you with ignoring this, but now you have not ignored it, namely the variations within countries. So there was a huge amount of looting in Russia, certainly, but there was a huge amount of looting in Hungary.
Yeah.
And there was a lot more looting internally in Hungary. It was outside too, of course. But I want to also speak to the idea of whether or not people knew what was happening, because on the one hand, the question of the polarization, the economic polarization of the country was very much understood and studied and discussed. But what was not so much discussed and is now is that people were enamored, intellectuals were enamored of liberal democracy.
Mhm.
And the idea that that was going to be, that that's what they were getting was extremely powerful for all those people who write things. What is now happening is those very people are saying, we were stupid. Okay, but this is much, much later.
Yeah.
And it's not so much we were stupid, we were fooled.
Yeah. We were played. That's the sentiment that I hear so often, is that we came believing in the principles of liberal democracy, all of this stuff that the West told us for so long, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Voice of America, people are listening, you know, the golden, this is the light that failed that Krastev talks about, right? There was this real belief that this was what was coming. And I do think, and Ivan Krastev also talks about this, as does Timothy Garton Ash, that there was a sense that socialism could have a human face. There was a 1968 kind of dream that you could have like a social democracy, that you could have the social safety nets and a dynamic economy with consumer goods, you know, and some feedback mechanisms and price signals and things like that. What they didn't understand was this incredible stark trade-off. I don't think that was made clear to people. That's why the idea that Aslan suggests in 92 that people are properly informed about what their countries are going through. There's an incredible moment in that We Were Stupid book where Kroll talks about how the prime minister of Poland had to sign a document like approving some IMF conditionality, and it wasn't in Polish. It was in English. So he looks to the finance minister and he says, I can't sign something that's not in Polish. And the finance minister says, you don't have to read it, just sign it. Right? So there was this incredible understanding that you had to do things quick because people are going to figure it out. I can tell you from my own experience, just to talk about the internal looting, some of my early books were about the internal looting of Bulgaria. I wrote a book about the tourism industry. My second book was about the lead zinc mining industry in Medan. And I can tell you that in those interviews that I did with Western businessmen in the 90s who were, you know, basically taking advantage of the circumstances in Bulgaria, one of them, an Irish gentleman, was very honest. And he said to me, look, when this started in the early 90s, the Bulgarians didn't know how much money to ask for. So they were asking for bribes of like $500 or $1,000, which we were happy to pay. It was only when they started to wise up and realize that they were taking $500 for the sale of a multi-million-dollar enterprise that they wanted a serious cut. And it's then that we started talking about corruption and rent seeking because we weren't willing to share the loot. And so I think that that internal story is also, you know, it's an interesting kind of a chicken or the egg question, right? People who grew up under communism were told that capitalism was an unjust economic system where the people who were willing to be the most rapacious and greedy win. I mean, that's what Gordon Gekko's speech in Wall Street in 1987 is all about. Greed is good, right? So you're, you know, a local elite, you might be the manager of an enterprise in your country, and you realize that this foreign investor is going to come buy this enterprise and strip away all the metal. I mean, I saw in Bulgaria, hotels, they would sign privatization contracts with a clause that said that they would keep the workers employed for 3 years after the privatization of the hotel. And Greeks would come over the border in the middle of the night with trucks, and they would take top to bottom windows, beds, lighting, carpet, toilets, fixtures, everything. And in the morning, there was a hull. Workers show up, and what does the government do? They can, the privatization contract has been violated. All they get back is the land and the hull of the building that's sitting on it. That's how it played. That's how it worked. So is it surprising that managers, you see that happen once and you're like, hell, I can asset strip too, right? It was the wild, wild East. And there was a lot of internal looting, but it was precipitated, as I think Stiglitz says, by the ways in which the reforms were done. Because it would not have been valuable to asset strip if you couldn't spirit the resources out of the country using liberalized capital accounts. If the capital accounts, by the way, China did not liberalize capital accounts, which is why the Chinese transition was much more gradual and the Chinese did not lose billions of dollars into Western banks.
It doesn't surprise me that these people would have exited that amount of money, given the technology of the SWIFT system and that kind of thing. The real question is, how did they accumulate that amount of capital with nobody noticing or saying, hey, what about mine? You know, I mean, they're all cronies. And the second question is, what role did Pope Benedict play both before and after his demise as Pope.
You mean John
in-
Paul?
In that region. No, not, well, John Paul at that time, but even now, Benedict, you know, what was his role in all of that?
Get the mic to Angelina, who will be the final question.
Yeah, so,
I'm
oh,
just gonna have her ask.
okay,
you more,
great,
just
great, great,
stack
great,
it
yeah,
a bit.
okay.
Thank you so much. In some ways, I feel seen. So thank you, and I wish you were also giving this talk in the Milton Friedman Institute.
Maybe
next
year.
But my
Okay.
but my question is, in some ways, I'm listening to you and I'm thinking, oh my God, all the right-wing nationalists were actually right. So how do you tell the story without also giving that kind of waking that monster or legitimizing that monster?
Oh, that is what keeps me up at night. And there are a couple of reasons why. First, when Taking Stock of Shock came out, it was reviewed very positively in China by very high Chinese Communist Party members at the Institute of Marxism. And Mitchell and I had no idea that the Chinese would be reading our books. But I think for the Chinese, it has been extremely useful to say, look at what a disaster Eastern Europe was because they tried to implement democracy at the same time as economic reform. So that's a big problem. Second, Putin, Orban, Kaczynski, right? All of these guys, the AfD in Germany, Höcke, all of these guys are saying what I'm saying. Now, I've been saying all of this stuff for a long time, but so have they, right? And the one thing that I find really interesting is that it's not just the crazy right-wing people who agree with me, although they do. It's also the crazy left-wing people, or not so crazy left-wing people, right? Who are basically saying this is capitalism, capitalists gonna capitalism, right? That's what they do. So why are you surprised? Like this is how the world works. You're naive to think that there was any other outcome to this process than what happened. There was no other way. There's this sort of realpolitik identity of like this, the West, we won the Cold War. Jeffrey Sachs says it was not the end of the Cold War. The West won the Cold War. And when you win, you get to do whatever you want. That's the attitude. And that's very clear in these documents that I have been reading, that there's this real sense of like, we have to do it because if we don't, then the Germans will, or the British will, or the French, right? So there's also competition among the Western countries. How do I negotiate that? I don't know. I'm very sensitive to that. Like I really am, because I fear, I mean, it's not that Orban and those guys are imagining this, right? They're looking at the same data that I'm looking at. Stiglitz's speech with a reform was almost immediately translated into Russian, which you can find on the internet now, because people wanted to hear what he had to say. But on the other hand, and this is where I feel like it's very nice to have tenure. If we don't like right-wing fascists, if we fear their influence, we, as in the global liberal democratic West, we should not produce the conditions which give birth to them. And I think, unfortunately, and I mean, this is true in the United States too, we have created the conditions that give birth to populist leaders, just like Kornai said when he talked about Weimarization. So it's a tricky balance, right? I am very cognizant of that question. I don't know how I'm going to do it. And I know that the minute I write this book, people are going to accuse me of being some crazy nationalist, which I'm not. I'm not even from Eastern Europe, right? And I intend to use primarily American sources, which I think will also be like, these are their words, not mine, just very briefly, how did they get the money? How did they get that much money? It's called loans for shares. It was a 1996 program designed in part by the United States to keep Eltsin in office with the support of the oligarchs. You can read all about it. There are lots of contested stories about the loans for shares program, but a massive amount of Russian state wealth was put into the hands of a few people who then helped Eltsin stay in office.
We are unfortunately going to have to end the conversation there tonight, but thank you so much for this really illuminating, provocative, fascinating presentation. It was really wonderful. So thank you for being here.